Well, good morning, and I am so glad that you are here with us today as we conclude a series we began several weeks ago entitled Stranger Things, looking at some of the odd passages that we find in the Bible. Just a couple things to mention before we jump into today's message. First of all, it's Veterans Day weekend. If you're a veteran here today, would you stand up so we could see who you are and appreciate you all? We are well represented. If war breaks out here in this room, we're in good shape. We got a lot of people who are on it. Thank you all for your service, and if you're watching online, we say the same to you. And also online, we want to welcome the folks at the Weber County Jail who gather every Tuesday night and have become new friends to us. We're delighted that you are joining us as well. One more thing here to mention. We're doing something today during this message that we have not done for a while. But we love doing it, and we invite you to participate in it. It's called our Q&A. And so as we make our way through this message, you're going to see a phone number on the screen. That's Pastor Jimmy's phone number. Call anytime, day or night, especially 3 a.m. It's just wide open to you, and actually this is the number. And he's going to come up at the end of the service, and here together the two of us will answer a few of those. We can't get to all of them. We got a lot of questions in the first service, and we invite you to have your phone out and text a question if one comes to your mind. So let's turn our attention to our message for today. And we're going to look at some people who were dead and buried, and then they were alive again. That's strange. And what happened on that day and around those events, and also what does that have to do with people like us? So let me get us thinking in that direction of where this is going to take us by just throwing this out to you. My guess is every single one of us has been, to the movies. And before the movie starts, we always like to get there early. And what happens before the show starts, you get to see the what? The previews, right? And so you're sitting there with your $15 Dr. Pepper and your $20 bucket of popcorn. And you get to see not the show, but you get to see a preview of the show. It's the highlights. It is meant to get your attention. It is a little bit of a glimpse of what is to come. And the hope is that it will entice you to come back and lay down another $75 to see all of that thing that you got to see as a preview. And a lot of times the screen looks like this, and then what comes after it are just glimpses of a bigger show that has yet to come. Keep that image in your mind's eye, because the event that we're going to look at today is a bit of a preview of something else that is yet to come. And so what happened in the past is a glimpse of a little bit of what is still in the future. And it has a lot to do with you and me. So let's jump into this passage. It takes place on the day when Jesus was crucified, when he was nailed to a Roman cross. And there's a whole bunch of events that surround that day. We're not even going to look at all of them. We're going to look at some of them in this passage that takes us to people who come out of their tombs and are alive again. At noon, darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus called out with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you abandoned me? Some of the bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, holding it up to him on a reed stick so he could drink. But the rest said, wait, let's see whether Elijah comes to save him. Then Jesus shouted out again, and he released his spirit. That's the way of saying his body died in that moment. And at that moment, the curtain in the sanctuary of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Jesus is crucified outside of the city of Jerusalem. And when his body dies, we're given this flash into the city of Jerusalem, into the temple in Jerusalem, and into a specific place in the temple in Jerusalem, the sanctuary. Now, the temple, you may probably already know, was the center of Jewish life. And for hundreds, even thousands of years, the idea was God's presence resides in a place called the Holy of Holies. And that was not a place to be trifled with. And so it was walled off, and there was one entrance. And over that entrance, there was a 4-inch thick curtain that was draped across there. And not just anybody could walk in there. In fact, just one time a year, the high priest would be allowed to go into the Holy of Holies and to make a sacrifice there in that place to cover the sins of the people for one more year. And it was serious business. Tradition tells us that they would even tie a rope around the waist of the high priest who would go in there. Because if things weren't done in exactly the right way, scratch one high priest, and people would just pull him out by the rope. Because you did not dare enter that place, because when sinful people encounter a holy God, boy, there is a big gap between those two things. And so you don't take that lightly. And in the moment when Jesus dies on a cross, what happens? That curtain that stood as this dramatic symbol of sinful people being kept at a distance from a holy God is torn. And you notice it was torn from the top to the bottom. That what Jesus did was he made a sacrifice that now granted access directly to God. Doesn't mean you just walk in cavalierly and just treat it lightly. But what it means is everything that was necessary for sinful people to gain access to a holy God, Jesus just did it. And so now that space is open, and God would no longer reside in this one space in a temple made with hands. Instead, he was going global, and he would indwell all those who would put their hope and their trust in him. And that happened in the instant that Jesus died his sacrificial death to make atonement, payment for the sins of all those who would put hope and trust in him. And so what that means for us is the same thing that it meant that day, that Jesus' power grants access to divine relationship. How do people like us have a relationship with a holy God? It's not our doing. It's what Jesus did in our place that grants us access. That's how we get there. And so what he came to accomplish when he came 2,000 years ago still stands true today, that people like us have access to God. But it isn't our doing. We didn't initiate that. We didn't accomplish that. He did. And the way stands open. And people like us can come and belong to a holy God. Well, the passage goes on, and here the stranger part is coming here. The earth shook, rocks split apart, and tombs opened. 2,000 years ago, many people were buried in what amounted to a cave, and over the front of that cave, there would be a large rock that was rolled. That was to seal that tomb and to prevent looters and others from doing things that they shouldn't do in those places. And in the moment that Jesus dies, the ground shakes, some of those rocks split apart, some of them move away from the opening of the tombs, and it's as if now there is this dramatic pause. The graves are open, and something has yet still to happen. But here's what it is. The bodies of many godly men and women who had died were raised from the dead. They left the cemetery after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city of Jerusalem, and appeared to many people. That's strange. And we wonder, what is up with that? Here's what a lot of commentators believe, that in the moment that Jesus was raised from the dead, it doesn't say all people, it says many were raised, and likely these were people who during Jesus' time in this world, his 3 years of public ministry, they came to the place where they put their hope and trust in him. Did you notice it said many godly men and women? So these were people who had entered into that relationship together with God. And so when Jesus rises, a whole bunch of people come with him. Not all, but many. And they go back into the city where every indication of this passage is they were known to people who were still living. And so they go and they appear to people, and we're not told exactly what they say, but I imagine it was something like this. Hey, you remember you came to my funeral? I'm back. And remember I put my hope and trust in Jesus? Guess what? I knew he was great. I didn't know he was this great. But they were alive again. Now, the question that some people ask around this passage is, was this a resuscitation or a resurrection? And here's the difference. Resuscitation is that people who had died are brought back to life. They live for a period of time again, but then they die again. So in that case, they would have not one funeral, but they would have two funerals. People who are resurrected are brought back to life, and they don't die again. And they head off into eternity, and they're good to go at some point. So what was Jesus doing at this point? And again, you know what? It's just not clear. But here's what we do know from what Jesus did on that day. Jesus' power controls life and death. He has power over that, and it's not even hard for him. And it's really not the first time that we see glimpses of Jesus' power and control over life and death. 3 times in the New Testament, Jesus shows up either at or around shortly after a funeral. And I'll just, put it in these terms. Jesus had a hard time with funerals. He didn't like them. He didn't like death. And so when he would show up, he would do something that was quite out of the ordinary. One time there was a young girl who had died. And Jesus says, no, she's not dead. She's just sleeping. And they're like, well, we kind of know what death is. I mean, she's dead. And Jesus goes and he says, young girl, get up. And she does. Jesus controls life and death. And it's not even hard for him. It's just one word. Another time, there is a mom who is part of a funeral procession leading her dead son out to be put to rest, to be buried. And Jesus comes across that event, and here is that casket being let out, and all the people that are in procession, and this grieving mother. And it says that Jesus' heart is filled with compassion toward this woman. As far as we know, he didn't even meet her before that day. And he walks over and he tells the people to stop, and he tells him, young man, get up. And sure enough, he does. And he gives her back to his mom, and there is this incredible reunion, and no doubt they go back and they celebrate that day, which should have been the saddest day, becomes the greatest day because of what Jesus was able to do. He has power over life and death. Another time, Jesus shows up after the funeral of his friend Lazarus. He comes 4 days late. And Jesus walks over to the tomb where Lazarus has been laid to rest. He says, roll that big rock aside. And he calls him out, and people are like, it's been 4 days. It's not a good idea. It's not going to smell really good. He says, Lazarus, come on out. And his friend walks out of the tomb. Jesus has power over life and death, and it's not even hard for him. And we have the opportunity for our lives to be safe in the hands of the one who controls all of that. Not one of us here, we had any say over when we were conceived, when we came into this world. And there's a day coming, and we don't like to talk about it, but we all know it's reality, that there's going to come a day where our lives will come to an end. And we wonder, what then? And when Jesus was here, in this little preview, there was an unmistakable way for us to understand, you know what? All of those issues that can keep us lying awake at night and staring at the ceiling, recognizing that we don't have power and control over them, he does. Our lives are safe in his hands. He threw open the doors to a relationship with God. The temple has been opened, the curtain has been torn, and he controls life and death. And he came to make a way for us. Regardless of how all these events played out, and there's more that we don't know about all these people who came back than we do know, but we do know in an unmistakable sense, Jesus has power over life and death. Here's what happens next in that passage. The Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened. They said, "This man truly was the Son of God." One of the titles of Jesus, it is a title of divinity. He's saying, surely this guy was God in the flesh. That's an amazing statement from somebody who has just been part of nailing Jesus to that cross, somebody who obviously to this point had been in opposition to Jesus. Now he comes to a different conclusion. Not everybody else did that day, but a few did. Where is it that spiritual life and vitality begins? How does that even happen? How is it inside of your heart or mine that if we, have a relationship with God today, where did that come? And we might think, well, I just took a step in that direction. There's something that came first. Jesus' power brings spiritual life and vitality. God begins the work that opens us to even entertaining the idea that there is a God who loves us, and a God who invites us through all that he has accomplished to put hope and trust in him. You say, okay, that's what happened that day. Well, that's great. But remember, it's a preview. And what happened with those many godly men and women who came out of the tombs, there's another day coming when everybody is going to be raised. So let's take a look at that a little bit. Because as much as Jesus said one day to his disciples, he said, you know what, I'm going to be led away and crucified, and then I will be resurrected again. It was not like he kept that a big secret, but for them it kind of went right over their heads. And many times when he talked about those events, it was like the disciples on the other side of that were like this, yeah, that's all nice and good, but Jesus, we're talking about something really important here. Which one of us is the greatest? Jesus, we got some really important stuff to settle. Which one of us is on the top of the heap? I suppose that Jesus is talking about his life and death and resurrection and all that comes along with it. And just like they either missed it or didn't comprehend it, there was this reality that Jesus shared with them that just kind of went right by them. Well, here's what Jesus said about another day that's coming, and it's not the only one. One day, everyone will see the Son of Man coming on a cloud with power and great glory. That day is yet to come. Jesus, one day, is coming back. And if you ask me, well, what day is that? Here is my deep theological answer to that question. I don't know. And you know why I believe that's the right answer? Because Jesus said, nobody knows the day or the hour except Father in heaven. But boy, people being people, we continue to try to set dates to it. And anytime you see somebody set a date, you can know one thing for sure. It's not going to be that date, because Jesus said, nobody knows the day or the hour. But I know in my own lifetime, people have said this, it's going to be 1988. And then it was going to be 1994. Somebody did the math, literally, and cracked the code on a whole bunch of stuff in the Bible and realized there is no code. But somebody believed that they had done that in 1994. Then there was Y2K. Remember that? And the computers were going to go haywire, and the world was going to be in chaos because we only had 2 digits, not 4 digits on the computer. Here we are. Then the guy who said 1994 said, oh, I added up the numbers wrong. It wasn't 1994, it's 2011. And then the next year was 2012. And you remember when the Mayan calendar came to an end and everybody thought, well, that's it. It's going to be the end of the world. And here we are. Jesus said, nobody knows the day or the hour. And there is no secret code for us to try to crack. Jesus made it clear on that day, he has power over life and death. He's going to win. Jesus talked about another day in the future. And it's a day on which he will win in a final and an ultimate sense. Sometimes when the Ebola virus breaks out, I've been asked the question, is that one of the signs of the end? Because there's, a bunch of things that wipe out a whole bunch of people that are talked about in the book of Revelation. Let me just say this. This year, fast food will take more people out than the Ebola virus. So put down the chalupa and stop worrying about the Ebola virus, which is a sentence I never thought I would actually say out loud. Put down the chalupa, don't worry. You know, we had a blood moon not that long ago, and people say, is that a sign of the end of the times? Because it talks about all these heavenly symbols. And you know what? I don't know, because Jesus said no one knows the day or the hour. But we do know it's coming. And on that day, what was previewed on the day when Jesus died and when he was raised again from the dead will play out in a full and ultimate sense. A couple words around that day from the book of Revelation. And I saw a great white throne and one sitting on it. The earth and the sky fled from his presence, but they found no place to hide. I saw the dead, and here it comes, both great and small, standing before God's throne, and the books were opened, including the book of life. And the dead were judged according to what they had done, primarily whether we say yes or no to Jesus, as recorded in the books. And there's a whole life that comes along with what we do with Jesus on the other side of saying yes or no to Jesus. The sea gave up its dead, and death and the grave gave up their dead. And so here's the thing, everybody and all were judged according to their deeds on the other side of what we have decided. Then death and the grave were thrown into the lake of fire. This lake of fire is the second death. And anyone whose name was not found recorded in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. A couple things about what that says. And some of those words, they're hard. But Jesus makes it clear that on that day when he comes back, not everybody is going to be good to go. And the day to decide what we're going to do about the one who gained us access to a relationship with a holy God, the one who holds power over life and death, and my life can be safe in his hand, and so can yours, the one who begins and sustains spiritual vitality. It's not there and then, it is here and now. And the reason that Jesus came is so that he could accomplish what we could never do, because we could never make it on our own. And the reason that Jesus would share reality about the future was not to scare us, but was to show us God's heart and how much God longs for every single person to belong to him, to put hope and trust in him. I'm going to date myself a little bit with this, but if you grew up in the church in the 1970s, does anybody remember a movie called Left Behind? Man, if you saw that, it scared the hot place out of you. And I think that really was the idea, was that, hey, you better or else. Here's the thing about the Bible. There is some reality that is very sobering and we need to take very seriously. But here's what the Apostle Paul said when he was talking about future events. He says, so encourage one another with these words. When we put hope and trust in Jesus, the goal is hope and confidence and assurance. But we also have to recognize that Jesus, who talked about it more than anybody else, said at the end of this life, for every single person, that there's one of two spiritual realities, and what we just read portrays an eternal separation from all that is good, and namely, that is a relationship with God. And God doesn't share that with us just to scare us so we're terrified. He shares reality with us so that we can respond to the grace of God and put our trust in him. That's not the only thing that's pictured. Here's the other side of that eternal reality. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud shout from the throne saying, look, God's home is now among his people. This is a community. No more obstruction. This is in God's presence. He will live with them and they will be his people. And there's this picture of community. God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All those things are gone forever. All of the sin, all of the evil, all of the darkness, all of the sickness, all of the things that mess up our life here in this world will forever be done away when Jesus comes back. And the one sitting on the throne said, "Look, I am making everything new." And then he said to me, "Write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true." And he also said, "It is finished," which is exactly words that Jesus spoke on the cross, by the way, when he died. "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life." Our opportunity is here and now to decide what we're going to do with Jesus. On the day when he died, he gave us a little preview of what is to come. And there is the opportunity for people like us to belong to a holy God. And it's not our doing, it is his. He opened the way to a relationship with God. He holds the power over life and death in his hands, and it's not even hard for him. He's the one that makes us spiritually alive to him and sustains that as well. And so let me ask you this question. If you have never said yes to Jesus, you've never put your hope and trust in him, let me just ask it as simply as I can. Why not? Why would you not? Commit yourself to the one who has done everything necessary for you to belong to him, to be forgiven, to be brought to life in this world, and to have your life safely in his hands in what is to come. One day, Jesus is coming back. But the day to decide what we're going to do about Jesus is not there and then. It's here and now. And there is one who has the power over life and death, but we need to make sure that we understand there is only one, and his name is Jesus. And the good news is he loves you, and he loves me, many times in spite of us. And he loves us so much that he made a way for us to belong to him. And just like he predicted what would happen at his death and at his resurrection, he predicts that there's another day to come. And on that day, we're either welcoming a friend who's taken us eternally home, or we stand in opposition to the one to whom we have said no, whether we've voiced those words or not. But know this, his heart's desire is that we would trust him. Anybody can belong to him because of what he has done. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads together with me. And just before I pray, I wonder if perhaps on this day and in this time, it is an opportunity to take that step into a relationship with Jesus. It begins by us acknowledging the truth about ourselves, that we've fallen short of God's mark. The Bible says we're all in the same boat with that one. We've all missed it. And it also involves us asking for God's forgiveness. We need it, and we can't do it ourselves. But that's why he came. That's why he died on the cross for us, was to make payment for your sins and mine. Should have been me. Should have been you. But it was him. And when we put our hope and our trust in him, we can be forgiven. Not someday in the future, in that moment. And we can belong to a holy God, not because of what we've accomplished, but what he has. It also involves committing our lives to him, that our intention is to follow after him. Doesn't mean we're going to be perfect, but what it means is that we're going to give him the leadership over our lives. He gets to call the shots. And there's a learning process involved in that, but he gets to be the teacher. We get to be the student. He leads us on. Lord Jesus, thank you that anywhere, anytime, anybody can pray that kind of prayer and be made right with a holy God. And to think that's all you're doing. And you did it knowing exactly who we are and all that goes on in these hearts and lives of ours. and still you did it. We thank you for all that you've accomplished. Thank you for the opportunity to spend this time together here. And God, I pray that you would lead us on together with you and help us to discover more of what you have for us that leads us toward life. So we give this all to you in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen.